Hello and welcome back to A Modern Pharmacist. Following on from the last episode, which was Lp(a) and a biomarker that we don't test enough of, and being honest, probably very little of in the UK, but something that has a lot of value when it comes to cardiovascular risk and when you are assessing cardiovascular disease. This is another biomarker that we are going to discuss today, ApoB, which as little as 2 years ago, I didn't know too much about. So it's not like I'm trying to call out all health professionals for not knowing anything about it. But since then, there has been a lot of information surrounding that with guideline updates and a lot of social media, YouTube and articles on the internet where they are trying to promote the information that's being spread about this biomarker. So it's ironic that 2 years ago, I didn't know too much about it, but now having understood what it is all about and the benefits of it, it baffles me as to why we do not use it, especially given the fact that it's been well known in cardiovascular medicine for over 30 years, which again is another baffling point. This episode, again, will not require you to be medically inclined. I will try to walk through it in as easy a sense as possible because it's all good and well that everyone who is medically trained understands this episode, because I feel like you should know about this to give to your patients. But from a patient point of view, it's always good to know what you should be seeking when it comes to testing and how can you best assess you as a person when it comes to your cardiovascular risk. So I'm going to start from the very beginning. And we've all, hopefully, if you've listened to any of the podcasts before, anything that I've done online, you should be aware that because cholesterol is a part of the lipid family, means that it is not soluble within water. So if you were to drop cholesterol along with any oil into water, it makes droplets and it doesn't disperse. And essentially your blood is water. That is the plasma component of it. So when you put fat into your blood, it doesn't transport. It will then form these massive globules and it could lead to a lot of complications down the line. So the body come up with a system for that, and it is to put it in these particles called lipoproteins. And it is essentially a ball in which you put in all the fat. It's got some proteins and all the other things around it, which allows it to then go around the body and be delivered to the point at where it needs to be. And there's a lot of different types of particles which we use. So the ones that are going to be of interest today are as follows, and I will explain them in greater detail in a minute. But it is chylomicrons, low density lipoproteins, which you should be familiar with, intermediate density lipoproteins, and very low density lipoproteins. The reason I've focused on these is that these are all a part of the ApoB family. And why these are of great interest, especially when it comes to a subset of the ApoB family, is that these have the ability to cause atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, meaning that they have the ability to get lodged within the arteries, which starts or is one of the components of forming a plaque, which then leads to blood obstruction and ischemia, which can lead to mainly heart attacks and strokes, depending on which artery is affected. Now, in order to carry on in this episode, I will explain what these particles do when it comes to their actual function. So the first particle I did mention was chylomicrons. Now, when you have a meal, food comes into the gastrointestinal tract, and when you absorb the fats, I'm not going to go into how it's broken down, but once you absorb the fats, it needs to be put into one of these particles. And the particle that it chooses is the chylomicron, which if you were to visualize it, it is, let's use it as a football. It is massive. And the majority of its components are triglycerides, which is a form of fat, and the other components of cholesterol esters, and you have phospholipids as well. And what it does is that it takes the fats that have been absorbed from the point of the intestine. It goes through your lymphatic system and then eventually will make its way to some of the tissues, such as the muscle, where it will pull out some of the fats for energy, and the rest of it goes to your liver. And the liver, when it comes to lipidology, is crucial because it is the only organ that can really process the majority of the fats when it comes to cholesterol, when it comes to triglycerides. So that is why the liver is pivotal in lipidology. So that is what a chylomicron does. When it comes to very low density lipoprotein, intermediate density lipoprotein, and low density lipoprotein, I will just shorten these now to VLDL IDL, and LDL. That is a progression essentially. So once the VLDL gets rid of some cholesterol and triglycerides, it then loses its density, and that is in comparison to the protein content. So that is where it comes from. If you were to take the cholesterol particles out and put them in a centrifuge and spun them, you would then get a different gradient, all based on their relative densities. So that's where the name comes from. So when you think of VLDL to IDL to LDL, they usually take the cholesterol from the liver to the point of where it needs it. So whether that be a certain cell in the body. And these three are known as atherogenic because these are the ones that have the potential to lodge within the artery walls. Now, the difference between chylomicrons and the subset of three that I've just mentioned is that they all contain an ApoB particle. So what an ApoB particle is it's essentially a signaling molecule. And the beauty of ApoB is that there is one per one particle. And I will go on to why this is beneficial in a minute, but I'm just going to set the scene. So each one of these particles, whether it's a VLDL, a chylomicron, an LDL, all has one of these signaling molecules. The difference is that on a chylomicron, it is classed as ApoB48, and on the other three, it is known as ApoB100. And it's to do with the size of the ApoB molecule, but also when I'm going to discuss the atherogenicity, it's always the latter three that I've said. Chylomicrons are just there for completeness, but they will also form a part of your blood test. So that is essentially the baseline of what we need to know, is that is what we are discussing today. HDL doesn't come into it because it has a different family, which is the ApoA, but capital A, not the little a that we discussed last week in lipoprotein A. And why this is such a pivotal thing is that when you get a standard lipid panel, so you go to the GP, I use GPs in this because obviously it's the point of contact in the UK, but you go to any health service and you say, can I have a cholesterol profile? They will do the classic LDL, non-HDL, total cholesterol, all these things. And when you get it back, it's a concentration. And that is the amount of cholesterol that has been contained within those particles in the blood that you have sampled. It doesn't tell you the size of the particle, nor does it tell you the amount of particles that's within, which is where the ApoB comes in. So now you know that one particle of ApoB is attached to a particle of cholesterol. In essence, you can then determine, well, I know the weight of ApoB, so I can work out how many particles of cholesterol there are within the blood at any one time. And that is more beneficial because of how atherosclerosis works. So when you think of an artery, so the best way to think of it, I always try and think of analogies where you can think of it, but think of a cross section of a pipe. So a water pipe that you have in your house, that is a clean artery. So if you just got water going through it, that's fine. That would be your blood. But if you had some sediment, so let's say you had some rocks in there, okay, and you know that damage to the pipe happens when the rock hits the pipe wall, which is what essentially happens when you've got cholesterol with a few other things happening in your arteries. But what happens is the cholesterol particles hit the arterial wall, they will go into it, and then that's when it can start to cascade. So that's the analogy we will use. But what we do with blood tests today is, instead of me telling you how many rocks are contained within the water going through the pipe, I just tell you that the total weight of the rocks going through there total up to 1 kilogram. So that could be one big rock, which has a kilogram. It could be two at 500. It doesn't tell you. But why that's important is that if you have an idea of how many rocks are in there, you have a decent idea of working out how many times are they going to make contact with the pipe wall, because that's the thing that's of real importance here. Is if one of them rocks goes through and doesn't touch the pipe wall, that's good. But when you increase the amount of rocks, even though it's the same weight, you are then increasing the amount of contact with the pipe wall, which is then going to increase damage. And that is essentially what happens in your artery, is that we get given a concentration that could be in one massive LDL particle. Very unlikely, but it could be. So if that goes through, then there's really no risk of it happening. But it could be in 10,000 little LDL particles, and then we know there's a good chance of a few of them getting lodged within the arterial wall. And that is why ApoB is such a significant biomarker, is that it allows us to look at the cholesterol, because I'm not saying the panel that we get normally is obsolete. We need to use that in conjunction with these new biomarkers. And the more data you have, I've always been an advocate for this, is that it gives you a better picture of where you are in terms of your health. So if you have the amount of cholesterol concentration and you've got the amount of particles, you can have a decent idea of, okay, well, there's a good chance this might have a lot of contact with the arterial wall. Can I, one, reduce the amount of cholesterol or particles in that blood going forward, or can I offset my risk of other things with relation to cardiovascular disease? And that is the beauty of it. It just gives you greater insight into where your risk management lies. But the issue with this is that, like I said, it's not in mainstream testing. So the normal panel that you get is the classic panel that I keep going on about, which is your LDL, non-HDL, etc. And I was thinking, well, what is the reason as to why this happens? Is it cost? Now, the cost of this biomarker is relatively inexpensive, so that is not the case. I know this from a couple of points. So there's a couple of physicians in America who actually says that the cost of ApoB is $2.30, and this was back in 2022. So that's in America, where it's highly capitalistic when it comes to medicine. In the UK, I've obviously got a private blood testing company, and I know how much it costs for that particular biomarker, and it's not the most expensive one that we do. It's a part of a panel, but when you actually add it up individually, it isn't excessively cost. So I thought, okay, well, it's not cost, so that's out the window when with regards to why we don't use it. Is it because we don't know too much about it? Going back through a few experts, so Alan Snyderman seems to be a massive expert when it comes to ApoB. He's wrote a lot of guidelines with associations such as the European Atherosclerosis Association, I think the American Heart Association. He's very well versed with this. And he said that this has been a standardized blood test since 1994. So I thought, okay, well, I know medicine moves slow, but not 31, coming up to 32, depending on when it was inducted. 32 years too slow. So that was sort of out of the window. And I thought, well, okay, they may not know too much about it. It may not be the cheapest. Them two things are being quashed. And I thought, okay, well, the last thing would be that there isn't enough evidence on its ability to cross-reference into cardiovascular disease. And again, this was disproven by Alan Snyderman and a lot of other authors. I can't name a few of them, so apologies to them for not giving them credit, but they were doing something called disconcordant analysis. And essentially what this showed was, if you have someone who's had the blood test through the standard lipid panel, so they have LDL cholesterol, they also have non-HDL cholesterol, then you have ApoB. If you've got someone then who has high LDL, does that correlate in terms of bad outcomes with someone who has high ApoB? And you would find that in a lot of instances that does happen, which you would expect. If you've got high of one thing and high of the other, high concentration with high particle number, it will lead to bad outcomes when it comes to this type of thing in lipidology. But the biggest thing was, when someone had a low LDL cholesterol concentration, which would normally be passed as normal on an average panel, some people could still have a high ApoB content in terms of particle number, which then shows that even though there's not that much cholesterol in mass in the artery, it's in a lot of particles, which then still has the ability to go across the membrane with regards to the arterial wall, get stuck and start an atherosclerotic plaque, which that was the big breakthrough there. And that's when I become really aware of it, that there's a lot of people that are walking around with normal lab results, which is technically incorrect. They should all be abnormal if they've got a high ApoB, and they're being mistreated. And when you are thinking about the formation of a plaque, I did go through that earlier on, but particle size is a big thing. So when you have a big particle of cholesterol, so let's say you've got one large LDL cholesterol and you've got one small, the damage that the large one could cause, if it got into the right places or the wrong places from our point of view, is a lot worse than the smaller one. However, this smaller one has the ability to cross the endothelial cell wall, so out of your artery into like the little gap in between, than the larger one. And that is what we are saying shows up on these panels more often than not, is that the people who have lower cholesterol concentrations are having high numbers of ApoB in a lot of circumstances, which are then leaving them undiagnosed or their management's not being optimized to the greatest extent, essentially. And I don't feel as though you can risk stratify someone without having ApoB, also LPA, but more so ApoB, because it gives us that instantaneous result there. Another thing which popped up, and I didn't know this again before I started looking into this high level of biomarkers with regards to cardiovascular disease, is that when we look at certain blood tests, so low density lipoprotein cholesterol, I don't know why I said that, LDL cholesterol, when we look at that, some people may think, okay, well, they take the blood sample, they put it into a certain machine and it measures that exact biomarker and the exact amount there. And actually, that's not the case. It's a calculation. So I always butcher the name and I need to actually look at how to pronounce this. I say it's the Friedewald or the Friedewald equation. And this is one of 8 ways that we calculate LDL cholesterol. So straight away, if you have 8 ways to calculate something, you can get 8 different results depending on where you are, which means it's not standardized. Which then, when you actually compare it with ApoB, which has proposed to be standardized wherever it's tested, it doesn't make that much sense. But anyway, 8 different ways in which you can calculate LDL. We use the Friedewald, depending on how it's pronounced, I've butchered it many times, equation. And this is an estimate of LDL cholesterol concentration in your blood, but it only works if your triglycerides, which are the level of fat that we use for energy, it's a normal storage form of fat anyway underneath your skin. If that's too high, it then offsets this equation, so then we can't use that. So I mean, in the large majority of cases, you don't see that many patients with too high a level of triglycerides, but there is potential for it to be falsely reported on someone's record, which again adds to the argument as to why do we not move towards this ApoB, which has a greater consensus. And that's another thing which we do not account for. So I'm trying to think of where I've walked through. I think by this point now, you understand that if you have a particle number, it gives us a greater insight into how many times it could hit and get lodged within the arterial wall. And ApoB does that. When we are looking at your ApoB, what makes up your ApoB test? I think that's a good thing to say in terms of what particles does it look at. So if you have 1 chylomicron, which is ApoB 48, that on average is about 10 times less in particle number than VLDL, which is ApoB 100. And that on average is about 9 to 10 times less in particle number than LDL. So you can see the magnitude straight away is quite a lot. So your ApoB blood test is largely made up of LDL. I'd say about 95%. And then the remainder of that is mainly VLDL. And then a small fraction is your chylomicrons. So even if you weren't to have it fasted, the chylomicron components wouldn't really affect it too much. But if you are getting a blood test for your lipids, it's always good to have it fasted, because like I've explained at the beginning of this episode, if you have a meal, the chylomicrons are made to then take away the fats from that meal, which would then temporarily elevate triglycerides in your blood and also ApoB. In the grand scheme of things, your triglycerides normally go up by, I would say, 1 to 2 millimoles max from what I've seen. But it's always good to be fasted because you get a better baseline, and it's a greater interpretation with regards to your LDL as well, now that you know it's a calculation. I lost the trail of thought there, but now I'm back on track. So that is what normally happens, and you can see the benefits of doing ApoB. The other benefit is that because it's based on particle number, it can pick up other things that we wouldn't necessarily pick up or wouldn't be able to advise on lifestyle or dietary interventions to a great enough extent without knowing it. And one of the examples that I can think of is, as I said before, VLDL is released from the liver which is a part of the ApoB family. Now, if you have a lot of triglycerides, which wouldn't show up usually in your LDL cholesterol or your non-HDL cholesterol, the level of VLDL particles will go up, because that is one of the main ways in which triglycerides are transported out of your liver after they've been received from your diet. So, for example, if someone has a high amount of refined carbohydrates or just a lot of saturated fat, essentially, their VLDL level would go up in terms of particle number, which wouldn't show up in the concentration. So, if you have a high ApoB and you can see from that someone else's triglycerides are really high, you could see that potentially the ApoB is being driven up through having high triglycerides secondary to the insulin resistance. It could be high amounts of refined carbohydrates, or like I've just said, high amounts of fat intake in terms of saturated fat. So then you can have a greater input into saying, well, actually, this would be a good dietary intervention, is instead of having refined sugars, let's go on to more starchy carbohydrates. It could be, let's go on to sourdough bread. It could be brown rice. It could be things that stop the great spikes within glucose in the body. And especially when someone's inactive, the body will convert carbohydrates that it absorbs into fat as storage, because we don't want to really waste too much energy, because as a lot of people are aware, the body is programmed to store energy in a lot of circumstances, because in terms of our genetics, we've not really evolved that much over the past, what would you say, 5,000 years, 10,000 years? But in terms of the environment, especially in the past 30, 40 years, where our diet had become so abundant because of the introduction of ultra processed food, but also the fact of the standard of living is a lot better now than it was even half a century ago. So all these other issues come in, and it's probably one of the reasons as to why cardiovascular disease is more prevalent than ever, is because we are in energy abundance and we don't really have the resources to, or we haven't implemented the resources such as these biomarkers to assess people appropriately, to give them really good insights into their health. Now, with regards to treatment, I'm not going to go into that too much. I feel like I will be doing a few episodes on how certain medications affect ApoB, namely statins, even PCSK9 inhibitors, but also how do your dietary, lifestyle, other factors, how do they have a direct translation into ApoB? But I will go on them in their own episodes. I'm not going to dwell too much on this, as I feel as though I get to a certain point in the episode and then I look at the time and I think, oh, I probably should make this up to maybe like 28, 30 minutes. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to do a quick recap of ApoB, and then we can move on to another subject going forward later on this week. So ApoB has one signaling molecule per particle, which is good because it gives us a particle number. And if you remember back to the analogy with the water pipe, if you know how many rocks are in that water which have the potential to damage the pipe wall, then it gives us a greater idea of our risk. And that is the same with our arteries when it comes to cholesterol. It's okay knowing that it's X amount of mass or cholesterol concentration, but if we know how many particles that's contained within, then we have a good idea of, well, that's probably going to be bombarded a lot more than what it should be. Can we offset that in other ways? And where the old traditional blood tests would say, oh, well, someone's concentration is normal, we can leave it. It may still be higher than the fact that someone could be producing large amounts of these cholesterol particles in smaller concentrations. So it then allows us to further refine treatments when it comes to dietary interventions, exercise, insulin resistance, or improving insulin resistance, and maybe dose modifications when it comes to certain treatments. It is beneficial for us to know it's not something that's been around for 2 years, 5 years. It's been around since, as far as I'm aware, 1994 when it was standardised. It isn't expensive. I don't know why we do not do it. It is being introduced, or it's included in a lot of cardiological, I can't even speak now. It's included in a lot of cardiology. I was going to say cardiological, which makes no sense. It's included in a lot of cardiology guidelines now, and a lot of people are pushing for it in the field because the evidence is overwhelming. And from what I've read, the reason as to why I think the American Association hasn't included it properly, or they haven't fully went towards this notion of using ApoB as a first line metric, was that there was one paper cited against ApoB. As with all studies, you are going to find a for and against. I just feel like you have to have a bit of a logical approach to certain things, have a bit of common sense. And in this case, I do feel as though knowing how many particles are present is beneficial for anyone going forward. If you've got this far, thanks for listening or watching, whatever platform you are on. And as always, it is for informational purposes only. It is not medical advice. If you are trying to seek an ApoB level, you will have to do it privately. If you are in the UK, in the US, I believe you can actually just ask for it when you go for certain regular checkups, because it's a bit different in the US, where if you ask for a blood test in the UK, if there is no direct need to you having that blood test, and I've had that first experience as a patient and as a physician, you get it rejected because it costs too much. But then we are happy enough to prescribe a lot of medication to people who self-inflict disease on themselves. So make sense of that what you will, because I can't and still haven't. And it really gets me frustrated, if I'm being honest. But yeah, you are not going to be able to get it on most national systems or health systems. So you will have to go privately. It is relatively inexpensive, and it is something that I do advise you should get. And the difference between this and LP(a) is that LP(a) is a once in a lifetime test. If you only get it done once after the age of 5, the likelihood is that it's not going to change level, whereas this can fluctuate quite a lot. And it has done for me. And I will go through reference ranges when I go into treatments in other episodes. But just for context, mine was towards the higher end of normal. I think mine was at the 80th percentile, meaning that my level was higher than 80% of the population. But when you actually correlated that to my LDL concentration, it was probably a bit higher than what you would think. So I am making maybe a few smaller LDL particles than the average person, for example. But yeah, before I carry on waffling on, I will leave you to it. Thanks for listening, and I will see you in the next one.